Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Q4 Multicloud Security Check Summit, the top threats to your multi-cloud right now. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine and Virtualization and Cloud Review, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsor, Rubrik, the Zero Trust data management company. Without their support, this event would not be possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator for the first of three information-packed sessions. But before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way in the next few days. This session will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsors have provided some extra resources you won't want to miss. They're available now on your console. At the end of this summit, you'll be asked to take a short survey. We know you guys are busy, but we're hoping you'll take just a moment to give us some honest feedback about today's event. And last but not least, at the end of our third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a Nespresso Virtual Plus Deluxe Bundle, which includes the Breville Virtual Plus Espresso Maker, an extra large water tank, and an Ariochino 3 milk frother. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our first session. What's attacking your multi-cloud today? For this session, we've called on Ian Thornton-Trump, Chief Information Security Officer at Cyjax and the CTO of Octopi Managed Services. Ian's 25-year career includes service in the intelligence branch of the Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian Forces Military Police Reserves, and the RCMP. Yep, that's the Mounties. He's been a cybersecurity consultant for both multinational and regional organizations, and today, as a virtual CISO, he helps both large and small companies build security operations and cyber threat intelligence programs. He's one of our favorite presenters. You are in for a good one. Take it away, Ian.
Hey, John, thank you so much. And it's my great pleasure to be here live from the Cayman Islands. And remember, folks, Cayman Islands isn't just about banking. It's about having some fun. Now, one of the things that is really exciting about this is it gives the opportunity to be really retrospective and look back a little bit on some of the key trends that we saw in 2023 and some of the InfoSec stories. And I don't really know too many CISOs that are like, playing what appears to be air guitar or climbing hard here on this third annual CISO ensemble. But the reason I put this one up is that I like the idea of seeing the light over the horizon, that perhaps, if we benefit from the knowledge and experiences that we've seen in the marketplace and following some of the big stories, we can take some real insight away. A huge shout out to Rubrik. It would be great if you could follow them on social media. You can also follow me on social media. Of course, I'm all over LinkedIn, and I'm also at PHAT, P-H-A-T, _Hobbit on X, or as everyone likes to call it, the former service called Twitter, which is now called X. All right, so one of the big things that CISOs were all a Twitter about, as it were, is really about the idea that CISOs are under attack. Well, they're not. And I want to congratulate LinkedIn on perpetuating the 2023 FUD of the Year Award for their CISOs Under Fire coverage and all of the folks that participated in perpetuating the idea that this was a terrible job and that everyone that does it are going to end up in jail. Now, I need folks to shut up on that because it is absolutely a distraction to the issue of essentially whether or not you're being way too creative when it comes to describing your cybersecurity messages in the marketplace, and that your customers, i.e. the American government being the primary customer, objects to the idea that you've been too creative when it comes to describing your cybersecurity strategy. Now, my good friend, Lou Covey, in Cyber Protection Magazine, basically wrote what exactly is going on. I'd encourage you, I put the link there in the slide that you're seeing. Check that story out because there's way more to this story than we're seeing right now. And that whole story arc of going from a class action or going from multiple class actions that become a consolidated class action, which is then, there's an attempt to dismiss that consolidated class action. That may or may not fail. If it fails, you then go to usually, 90% of the time, some sort of settlement. Well, what's interesting is that whole civil process results in enough information being put towards a court that then the feds can become involved. And that information can come up the food chain, if you will, to the SEC, which may decide to take a civil action against a person or persons when it comes to the issue of telling one security story where the reality is something completely different. And remember that the SEC does have a very useful investigative capability known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation in order to essentially help get the evidence of perhaps some fraudulent discussions that may be useful in the prosecution of an individual. Now, Lou in this magazine takes it one step further and really talks about something called 18 U.S.C. Code 1001, which is essentially fraud against the U.S. government. So what we see unfolding in the SolarWinds event is very similar to what may be unfolding when it comes to Progress Software. Progress Software was a software company responsible for the MoveIt appliance and service, and they have gotten in hot water as a result of the activities of the Clop ransomware group, where they vehemently suggested in defense of the 50-plus class actions, because it hasn't been consolidated into a class yet, that they had excellent security. Well, time will tell. And I feel that this is a new playbook, a new tactic that the Department of Justice is very interested in using that will eventually perhaps land those responsible that coerced, directed, or otherwise instructed the security folks to be a little bit too aspirational in terms of their description of the cybersecurity program of various organizations that they might work for. At the end of the day, what we learned from the Joe Sullivan case was something investigators and try and stay truthful. We still good to go here? I heard a beep.
Yes.
John?
Yeah, there was. But
okay,
you're still with us.
All right, cool. So, to sum up, the CISO role is always going to be a difficult and challenging role for any organization. However, the important thing here is to make sure that you're positioning yourself to show intent and improvement, and to accept the fact that you may not have the money to do everything that you need to do to secure that organization. However, you have to be truthful and you have to show that your intent was good. Because as soon as they can prove that your intent was wrong, then the whole house of cards may come tumbling down on you. So that's probably the biggest lesson learned in 2023 and moving forward. Now, I've used this slide before, but I do want to talk about what we're seeing in terms of the evolution of cyber. And you have this sort of broad breakdown of the years. And I think it's fair to say that we've seen a huge increase in the type and extraordinary impacts of cybersecurity issues and attacking adversaries. We are certainly into, what I guess hyperbolically could be described as a new paradigm. There's no question in that, because what we're seeing right now is an adversarial strategy that goes along three different lines. Okay, so the first is direct cyber attacks. Now, one can argue and say we've always seen those, right? But we've always seen them from two very narrow perspectives, which one was the idea that, it was a commercial exercise or an espionage exercise. What I would say to you now is that it's very much a blended threat, and from the threat actor perspective, especially as outlined in a new SciJax report that we've Redmond Channel Partners and the virtualization cloud virtualization people have uploaded to the portal. We're seeing a blended threat that includes all of these elements, also combined with deception and disinformation campaigns, especially when it comes to divisive issues within society, but also more externally when we see the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, which is exactly what that report that we're releasing to you kind folks today. You're actually getting it a week before the report is officially launched with a bit of buzz in the information security media, so you can be first to review it. I think what's important is the takeaway here is we're seeing this threat. We're seeing one philosophy echo across all of the threat actors, and that is this. They will tolerate cybercrime within their own companies if it's bad for their protagonists that are out there. So in the case of the common CRINC actors, which is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, we are seeing basically a Bond-like supervillain cyber capability being created, as well as mutual support across all of these entities against the United States and, by proxy, Europe and the UK. And we'll talk a little bit more about the impact that that's going to have. Now, everyone should do this. This is the one thing that I want everyone to do in 2024, which is go to DNS Dumpster, right? Put in your domain, and then download that list of hosts and ask yourself the following questions. Okay, this is the simple cybersecurity, if you will, external attack surface analysis. Okay, how are you going to get hit and why you're going to get hit? It's simple, right? Look at that list and find, is the system that is identified on that list? And keep in mind, DNS Dumpster is a passive DNS crawler, essentially. So this is what you're publicly exposing to the internet, right? 4 questions. Is the system still needed? Is the system business critical? Should it be an internally routed only system? And what is the business justification for the exposure? Take that list of hosts, shop it around in your organization, and try and figure out if what you have publicly exposed is all legitimately needed and that there's a risk calculation around that. And I certainly hope, and we'll talk a little bit about this in this webinar, and I certainly hope you have compensating controls and multi-layers of cybersecurity mitigating controls in front of these things, especially if it turns out that your list is all a bunch of business critical stuff. Okay, so that's the silver bullet to kill the evil cyber threat werewolves for 2024. Everyone should do this. Okay, let's now talk about what is actually being used to target organizations today. And it's really, really interesting. This is a wonderful list that Recorded Futures put together here, and I'm sharing it with you guys today because I think it really resonates. You can see an awful lot of infrastructure of different kinds. You're seeing firewalls, you're seeing exposure of internet services like on-premise Microsoft Exchange, all right? And you're seeing a number of your favorite brands and everyday business applications that are out there that we're using. This is the attack surface, folks. And this is what the bad guys are going after. Now, let's kind of group that threat into 2 bottles, okay? There's one bottle which is phishing links for credentials. That's a huge attack surface. Phishing links come in, they can come in on your phone. What the bad guys are after are your credentials in order to get into your cloud or on-premise tenants, because in a lot of cases, those credentials will allow access to VPN, but they'll also allow access to software as a service instances that are not supported with single sign-on. So another key takeaway to disrupt the enemy, if you will, the bad guys are attacking to get your credentials. the more you've implemented single sign-on, the more you've enabled things like account lockout, the more you've educated your employees about the importance to not use business emails for personal websites and systems, the more work that you've done to preserve and protect credentials should allow you some extra cycles to think about that external attack surface and the mitigations that you can do. Now, I don't want to go through all of these granularly, but I want to kind of lump them together because there is one trend that is really sticking out as it's a huge issue. One of the reasons why cyber threat actors are being successful in getting inside organizations is when we went to cloud, we soon realized that there are a number of silos in our own infrastructure. We might have a network team. We might have a security team. We might have a desktop services team. We might even have a cloud infrastructure team, okay? And if all of these folks are not aligned and don't quite understand what the major crown jewels of the organization are, that's exactly the silos within your organization that will get exploited. And that falls onto the shoulders of the heads of security and the CISOs that are out there. So if you want to be effective in your job, the first takeaway from this is in 2024, go out and be friendly and get some friends and have some conversations so that everybody is interested in helping out and being on board with the idea that it's a cyber village battling the monster of the bad guys, and you're just not on your own out there. And this is what we're seeing more and more, folks. The bad guys are exploiting those insecure interfaces and APIs, right? In some cases, it's a SQL injection attack that gets you access into the organization. But in other cases, we're seeing serious misconfiguration and unrestricted resource consumption ending up in denial of service, or broken authentication, or cipher suites that are essentially degraded to the point where the bad guys can decrypt if they gain access to that particular resource. So it's incredibly important that we look at the way we've structured APIs, the way we're managing APIs going forward, because that's becoming a very interesting attack surface, more of a programmable attack surface than the traditional kind of vulnerability presented. And then, obviously, a vulnerability is then exploited, and an exploit can result in ransomware or data theft or both. In the case of these APIs, the big attack is they leak data, they're not rate limited properly, and they may leak they may not have authentication at all, or even be locked down to particular domains and IP addresses. So many organizations expose these APIs for electronic data transfer, interfaces, et cetera, but the reality is really anyone can get access to that API. And if you know what you're doing, from a programming perspective, you can actually scrape an entire database worth of data just by utilizing that API interface. And this is where the organization has a big blind spot in a lot of cases on the misuse of that particular API, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But right now, when we go back and we look at Progress Software, for instance, and the MOVEit vulnerabilities that were publicly available, we're talking a plethora of different OWASP 10 and API-related issues with that particular piece of software. And this is where it gets really difficult after the fifth or sixth zero-day attack on that particular appliance, and that particular code running on that appliance. It becomes very difficult to defend and say you've got a world-class cybersecurity program, right? So this is where I'm talking about the use of a lot of SAST and DAST testing, and of course black box pen testing on these particular services that you have exposed, and getting, I'm going to say real programmers, not so much pen testers, but real programmers to programmatically manipulate stuff, okay? Now, I'm not saying that, you have to spend $1 zillion on testing one interface. But what I am saying is a standard type of set of attacks that you can do with Burp Suite or Nmap or, other proxies like the Z attack proxy or from OWASP. These are great places to start. But if you've got sensitive data, if you've got, the majority of your money being made for your company is through online interfaces, and you've got customer or employee or supply chain data to protect, you've got to look at those APIs as being the weak link, right? Now, I want to go over here a little bit too, because you'll see SDLC coming up more and more in the discussions, especially in 2024, as presenting the weakness to the organizations. Two areas again, and one of the things that you can do is get your inexpensive subscription to Grey Hat Warfare and look for your own company's exposure into S3 buckets and things like this. Now, in a lot of cases, it's not your own in-house development team that the problem manifests itself in. It's when you've hired a third-party development team that has created a S3 bucket that doesn't have, that has too liberal, shall we say, permissions on it, and on your behalf, you have a data exposure put there because of a third party that isn't practicing the best qualities of a CI/CD pipeline or CI/CD pipeline in terms of like the new way of building software that we should be doing. Now, there maybe are organizations that are still waterfall sort of methodologies and stuff like that, but Agile and the CI/CD pipeline is the new way of building a compatible with the cloud cybersecurity, robust cybersecurity application. And you can see right in the middle of this, you've got the test piece of it, test before release, deploy and operate, and segregation of duties, right? We don't want production only under extremist situations to be able to modify code that is actually running. This is why you need a DevOps. This is why you need a DevSecOps type of style of organization. And then again, what we want to look at doing too is really reducing the amount of external attack surface that we have through red teaming and pen testing. But just getting a list of your publicly exposed assets, well, I gave you the big hint for 2024. It's like, go to DNS Dumpster, crawl your publicly available exposed stuff, look at how it's constructed, be aware that if something is resolving to an internal set of IP addresses on public DNS, this could be very risky. So you really want to be aware of that and figure out if there are better ways to do things, i.e. internal DNS, yeah? Okay. This is where I wanted to point out in terms of this whole kind of like threat landscape from the post-breach. So we're seeing a couple of trends that are absolutely a bit frightening, and that is in the post-breach, we're now seeing a lot of class actions being launched. Pretty much anyone that gets breached of a sizable company, especially a public company, is now going to have the threat of legal action taken towards them, be it customer indemnification, which again, like from a customer perspective, if you've had legal, write your terms and conditions, your exposure is probably going to be minimal. But even MoveIt and Captia here in the UK are faced with big class actions with customers basically claiming pretty significant losses as a result of delivery failures in terms of assuring a level of security. Now, just today, it came up in my news feed. CISA has a new secure software attestation requirement coming out that is eliciting public commentary. And it's quite possible that this secure software development attestation that is being asked to essentially sign off on is going to have 4 of the most powerful words in the English language from a legal perspective attached to it, which suggests under penalty of perjury. okay? Those are the worst. What does that mean? Well, it basically means that if you lie, it is a criminal offense now to lie. If you sign off a document that says under penalty of perjury, this will expedite the United States' DOJ in pursuing organizations that have essentially attested to a secure software development lifecycle when they have been proven not to have. And as I'm pointing out here, Progress Software facing the dozens of class action lawsuits, there is currently a court action to consolidate those into one. And these are the CVEs that I've indicated that have led to the threat actors being able to exploit this and gain access to all of the exposed interfaces. And we can see quite clearly that we're dealing with a lot of really common dog stuff when it comes to basic cybersecurity hygiene. SQL injection vulnerabilities, basically three there, a cross-site scripting type of attack as well. We've got remote code execution vulnerability, and we can see as well that these are all critical or high. And so this is just a case of one of the big trends that I see in 2024 is finding these legacy pieces of hardware that the business relies on or software that the business relies on, finding that it's publicly exposed, and going after it far faster than the current sort of 30-day vulnerability lifecycle. In fact, the latest instructions I've seen from one regulator is that, and I think actually it wasn't a regulator, it was an insurance company, has been asking for a 14-day patching cycle now. Now, think about the struggles that an organization is having right now to just patch infrastructure every 30 days. Now divide that in half. That means you're going to have twice as many resources assigned to looking after that particular task. So this new regulatory framework that is coming out about attestation that you have a secure software, I'm going to say, and as I said in my tweet earlier today and on LinkedIn, you're going to have to make sure that you have the evidence to back up that particular document that you signed, because under penalty of perjury is a pretty serious thing when you're attesting to something. And also in law, that then can, especially if it reaches a criminal level, that can result now on a lot of the liability shields that we've essentially relied on within the terms and conditions of your software licensing agreement becoming invalidated. So this is a really, really big trend. For many organizations are going to have to do this, especially if they're part of a government supply chain somewhere. Now, we're going to get into the bad guys and what they're going to do in a moment, but I want to kind of rewind a little bit and look at where we are right now. Many organizations, I think, have a level of certainty based on what they've managed to achieve so far. And I hope you've achieved something in 2023, be it, digital transformation, adoption of maybe AI solutions, upgrading, from an old antivirus to a new XDR, MDR solution, and hopefully making an investment in immutable backup for ransomware recovery. But as we kind of go on, we can see that the pace of cybersecurity development, the pace of threats are certainly putting in more anxiety, worry, doubt, and danger within the organization. So the antidote to this, I think, from the struggle bus garage here, is to create a safe learning environment. Every organization really does need a testing environment, a testing lab, so that the cybersecurity organization, working with IT, working with infrastructure, working with the server team, if you have a server team, and working, of course, with development, has a way to start looking at improving cyber hygiene with minimizing business disruption. I think that's really, really important moving forward. And then trying to define what are the actual business goals that you're trying to achieve with this robust security. I mean, if you're just doing things because compliance told you to do it, it means that for that moment, based on that hygiene of that particular compliance regime, you may be missing a lot of the really early kind of development phase of cyber attacks, because even though you're compliant, that compliance was based on the idea that there were certain predictable attacks that the bad guys would pull. I mean, who would have thought that a network monitoring piece of software would be used to distribute malware, right? It was kind of an unprecedented attack for its time, even though if we look back in history, we saw a group called the ShadowPad group way back in the day get their malware into a piece of software that every IT person, I think, on the planet at some time has used, called CC Cleaner. So that attack vector had been around, that threat model had been around for quite some time. And we can see, the consequences, especially in the Barracuda ESG situation, of what happens when you fail to sanitize an update file that then turns out to have a bunch of malware in it. Malware so persistent that the manufacturer and Mandiant and CISA all recommended that the device, the Barracuda ESG, get returned to the vendor because they could not get rid of the hooks that the malware put into that particular device. So if you want to talk about trends, if you want to talk about what's going to happen in 2024, it's that legacy stuff, it's that beige stuff that you've got sitting there. And if it's got any sort of exposure, you're going to have to move very quickly indeed in terms of your vulnerability management. All right. And I mean, this is exactly one of the things that really pops out at me is that web application firewalls and CDNs, content delivery networks, are really one of the things that we just absolutely have to have into place. It's absolutely necessary. I think, honestly, from a compliance perspective, a WAF and CDN can go a long way in giving your development group basically more time to get their act together and start really doing a quality SDLC. Because again, it's the teamwork that is really going to defeat the attackers when it comes to your infrastructure. And one of the things you can do to make it a lot more difficult to own an app is to have that web application firewall, a core rule set that's protecting against the OWASP type 10 type of attacks, that's not letting hosting providers gain access to your hosting provider infrastructure. A lot of the core rule set in the Amazon WAF, and I'm sure it's similar for Google Cloud Armor and the Azure firewall. You absolutely can lock your system down. You can geo-restrict it to just where your customers are or just where your employees are. There's a lot of power that you can do to really lower your attack surface from getting attacks from at least from the infrastructure that we know to be hostile out on the web. Now, I'm going to kind of now crescendo into a lot of threat actor issues. Now, one of the things that's very apparent that we're starting to see is the effects of global climate change. There's no question. Now, many of these countries are going to be struggling under economic terms. Maybe they're under a bunch of sanctions. Maybe they are, maybe they are suffering more severe consequences of global climate change. And here's a really handy table that kind of really, for me, draws it all together and kind of shows why I'm thinking about CRINC as like a Bond villain, with Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea being the major players in what is emerging to be a very hostile group who are attempting to form their own economic system that goes outside American control and doesn't cross any sort of American financial controls and sanctions that are there. You have a real need for currency and hard currency exchanges into actual cash money. And these groups are also in cohorts with each other when it comes to, of course, supporting the war in Ukraine in an overt way in terms of giving munitions to the Russians, as Iran and, of course, North Korea, who supplied 1,000 sea containers of North Korean munitions and ordnance to the Russians. And so if you have these geopolitical relationships where at least three of the organizations here, China is a bit of a special case because they're sort of a frenemy, although, their major group sort of exercises here are to steal all the things as opposed to disinformation or cyber attack all the things. But what we're really seeing is these protagonist nations are working together and trying to spread their influence out into other countries. Russia and Iran both have presences in South America and Africa. So it's important to understand that these countries are going to come under increasing pressure. And I think this is the other thing that we have to realize, that the more pressure we put onto these countries, they will react in turn, and that will, part of that reaction indeed includes cyber attacks, and that is exactly what we talk about in that SAJAX report that is all available to you folks. Another couple of notes about this, too, is that all four of these countries here have a high toleration for for-profit ransomware groups that are ultimately being sheltered by these host nations. On occasion, Russia offers up a cyber protagonist, usually a ransomware operator, and essentially offers them up quite possibly as a gesture, but sometimes as essentially a peace offering. And we see the attitude towards the disposality of these cyber threat actors of basically being told they're either going to work directly for the government themselves, conducting cyber attacks as per national policy, or providing a necessary level of financial support for the various governments, depending on the level of corruption and the level of scrutiny that's there. So all of these macro trends, including the effects of global climate change, because it's very difficult to maintain power in a regime if you can't feed your people. So all of these countries here are in an economic down spiral in a lot of ways, which they are using cybercrime to stabilize their own regimes. And over time, this will get more and more difficult for those countries, resulting in an increase in frequency of cyber attacks and trying to undermine the Western governments. Right now, there's a very active Russian campaign to attack national critical infrastructure, quite possibly aligned with Iran's recent revelations of attacking national critical infrastructure in the United States. Russia, just yesterday, an indictment came out about its interference within the UK and NATO countries along the lines of elections and the Brexit vote that we had here in the UK. So all of these playbooks, if you will, that these nation states are using end up at our firewalls as companies that are either collateral damage, directly targeted because they have a tangential link to national critical infrastructure, or again, cyber criminals that are somewhat sheltered by these regimes, targeting North American systems ad nauseum and what appears to be at random. Now, a lot of folks ask me, okay, Ian, so if we have this threat and it's accelerating, what are some of the things that we can do? Well, I already talked about what you're presenting to the internet as being the key piece in that puzzle. But more importantly, I think what we need to look at is paying attention to some of the resources that are out there for blue teamers. And it really starts with the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, especially in the mid-market, because the KEV, as we like to call it, is really going to give you the CVEs that are important to make sure that you're patched against. Now, let's keep something in mind. If you're an enterprise and you've got a cybersecurity function, a threat intel function, you're getting more up-to-date information that hasn't gone through a number of levels of vetting. The way the KEV would be vetted. Now, the reason, of course, is because CISA has to be 5 in terms of reliability, 5 out of 5 on reliability, 5 out of credibility. Okay, and in order to get there, you're going to have to go through a number of levels of vetting of the information that you're going to put out there. It's like they're too strategic to be part of the disinformation campaign that are being run by the bad guys. So when they say something, a vulnerability is weaponized and is being used by a threat actor, they may not give you all the details about that particular threat actor. Sometimes they say Russians or North Koreans. Occasionally they will actually name the group that's responsible for it. But the most important thing to pay attention to is if you have this thing, you need to consult the manufacturer, you need to take the manufacturer's workaround or the patch, and you need to apply it without delay, because the foot race between the bad guys finding your organization, they've already started the race. You're just finding out about it now. So from a defender perspective, you're going to have to move faster than you've moved before. And that means acting on intelligence about what your infrastructure has, what its vulnerabilities are, and how quickly you can find and patch that. Now, this is the compelling story that's out there in the marketplace, and this is why you see a lot of managed detection and response organization, SOC services, backup restoration, virtualization services. It's far easier to bring services back online in a cloud instance than it is to be running around looking for the install key for your CD. Okay, that's not a position anyone wants to be in. So when you hear about the cloud trends and stuff like that, take them with a grain of salt, because on-premise is a lot more effort to get back up and running, especially if that on-premise involves multiple different components that are all kind of a bit vulnerable, instead of snapshot technology and immutable backups from the cloud for recovery, and 24/7 services that are doing managed detection and response and being able to interface with your organization to keep those business critical apps running. So the game has changed a little bit from how it used to be. Now, I did put this thing in again. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek here, because you absolutely have to pay attention to what the WAF and CDN logs are telling you. So there's a compelling story here of certainly having awareness of the types of things that are hitting your organization, where they're hitting you from. And it's almost a story, too. If you want to be able to go full, cyber threat intelligence driven on what you're getting hit with, you might even think about adopting some leaning forward, moving left technology that's really going to take the fight to the enemy, like honeypots. And I have a little bit of insight in how honeypots now might be a bit of a game changer in a slide or two here. Regulator, what regulator? Honest to God, I thought, as many people did, that we would be in a position where the regulator was really going to show some teeth. And it seems to me that the regulators that are showing, the fangs are the Irish Data Protection Authority with their 100 million plus, in some cases 400 million fines that they've laid on Google and Meta. But the UK regulator seems to have backed away from anything too existential. Now, or existential to a business. Now, this is not what I would call unexpected. Anyone that thinks that a regulator was there to basically already victim punish a company that has already been victimized by a cyber attack has to take into the context of that's a pretty anti-business growth move. So yes, fines are dissuasive. Fines have to, mean something. But at the same time, they can't be so arduous that the business risks going under or having to lay off thousands of people because of a regulator fine. You're just going to find that becomes too anti-business, and at that point, when you're anti-business, it becomes highly political and difficult to justify. So what we're seeing is the initial surge, I would say, in fearing regulation misunderstands the idea that, first of all, it's something to be feared, and second of all, that the regulator's goal here is to actually try and protect your organization, but also send a message to other organizations that investment in cybersecurity is an important aspect of risk management. And I think when you start seeing it in that process where it is a dialogue, it is a conversation with the regulator, it is not instant fine. There's a long process of investigation, and then, of course, there's litigation and your lawyers and perhaps outside lawyers and third parties, third-party friends of the court, if you will, that may intervene and may have a stake in the game as well. So we cannot rely on regulators as an apparatus to change behavior. And I agree that the SEC and their calls for more transparency when it comes around cybersecurity are a good thing, but they are not an immediate thing, because as soon as you make a regulation like that, you need to have a bunch of precedences in order to determine the applicability and whether or not that's valid and if there's other mitigating circumstances. Everybody goes to summer camp. Right? Everyone has different experiences at summer camp. So I would say to you that we have to stop potentially relying on regulators to pave our way, and we need to be more proactive, and apparently lying is a terrible idea, which is, one of the key takeaways of this. Now, I want to get a little bit into now some of the hype around AI and steer a bit of a path here for everyone. So the first is, back in 2017, when there was a lot of discussion around AI, you had this amazing recorded future report come out. But, reading the whole report, you come to this line that basically says much of the ChatGPT code shared on the dark web and special access sources is like code that is publicly accessible. Now, this is important, and it was in 2017, by the way. I think it was a 2021 or 2022 report. The point here that I'm trying to make is that a signed binary that drops on one endpoint in your entire organization, it's one piece of software that drops onto an endpoint, and then, of course, reaches out to a command and control server, an IP address that has never been seen, contacted by any of your hosts in your organization, is kind of a smoking gun, right? Like, if that information and if that telemetry is being detected, it doesn't really matter about how the malware is coded, and it might not match any current sort of like hashes, but its activity is what gives it away. And I think this was the point that they were trying to make, that let's not worry too much about the malicious code being developed by AI. Let's worry about the activity and whether or not it looks sketchy and it doesn't sort of match previous activity. So we're moving away from behavioral-based into sort of almost heuristics and ending up at something called UBEA, which is User Behavior Entity Analysis, which essentially says, and it can be user or entity being, the endpoint, but the combination of behaviors that are standard versus anomalous is getting easier for defenders to pick out rather than for protagonist organizations to build, quote, undetectable code, right? Everything's detectable at some point. Now, the other thing that we're going to see very quickly, of course, is the attacks on exposed AI-driven models that some organizations have started looking forward to. We have very interesting attack surfaces because a lot of it is that SQL injection thing because of a particular library. We've seen that with some implementations, but we're also seeing the recent attacks where you tell the AI to write the word poem over and over again, and all of a sudden a whole bunch of sensitive information spills out of the model. So we do know that protagonists organizations are certainly interested in messing with AI implementations. But what I think we need to understand is we have to look at sanitizing that input and detecting when our AI models are starting to output something that makes no sense whatsoever. So there's a lot of work to be done on this, and if you caught some of my other previous presentations, you end up with a real challenge in organizations today in implementing an AI model that is going to be able to detect, or you're going to have to write the parameters, if you will, to allow it to do answer certain questions, but basically disable it from answering questions that can lead it down a garden path where it could reveal sensitive information. All right, and then a couple of things. This was the one that really caught my mind, about the idea that you can use AI to trap an adversary into a fictional network or a completely virtualized honeypot and waste that adversary's time and or get their telemetry, the binaries that they might be using to conduct an attack. This type of deceptive technology, active technology on networks does exist. I've seen an Israeli firm that has sort of pioneered this particular type of approach to cybersecurity, but it's also a really interesting way of trapping an adversary. And as you can see, with AI-based honeypot systems, you're looking at a 92% chance that you can trap an adversary in that infrastructure. That's a pretty high number, and I'm pretty impressed by that. So as we sort of get to the Q&A, so I'm gonna shake John up for this. I want to really look at where we were. So CAPTCHA, no longer web app protection. CAPTCHAs are basically a holdout to a threat model that was back in 2010 and 2015 with bots. Apparently now from this report, from this review, we're now seeing that bots are easier to solve CAPTCHAs than actual humans. This might be because as we're getting older, our vision is getting worse, and we're finding it increasingly more difficult for folks to even interact with websites, especially when it's in super tiny font, I have to say. I absolutely have to say that. And just if you're interested in jiving with some of what I've really talked about, it's really time now to be a cybersecurity leader in 2024 at every level in your organization. I've included some links to some of the resources that I've talked about and written, and I think now John, it's time for the big questions today.
It's time. We've got time for a couple of quick questions, folks. Type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. And those that we don't get to, by the way, we will just pass those along to Ian, and he's been pretty good about following up. So here's our first question. How do you feel about outsourcing SOC or MDR services?
Yeah, I'm feeling pretty positive about it. I mean, it's all, in the contract. But if you've got a infrastructure that is relatively up to date, that you're generally providing SaaS applications to your customers, to me, it's a no-brainer because it's really easy infrastructure to deploy, and there's going to be value with getting that set of eyes, trained eyes, to essentially deal with that. And the other area that I'd say is, listen, if you're serious about being able to recover, don't rely on in-house backup or even a third party. Look at outsourcing that to a backup as a service vendor for a level of assurance that you may not be able to get because backups is the last thing everybody wants to do and worry about them. But I'll tell you this: it's the first thing they're going to ask about when a system is down.
Fascinating. Okay, here's one. Ian, we don't do development. How can we stay on top of our software suppliers to make sure they are secure?
Yeah, this is a frequently asked one because of the nature of the security supply chain and all the challenges around that. So first of all is be in touch with your customer account rep and, make sure that you're having a great dialogue. Sign up for the customer newsletter. I know, we get an endless amount of emails, marketing FUD and stuff like that. Monitor their Twitter, build a Google alert, for that particular software vendor so that if anything is being said about an attack, a patch, an update, and of course monitoring the KEV is super important from CISA to find out, if a vulnerability is starting to be actively exploited. At the end of the day, knowledge is power, and the faster you can get the information about a partner in your software supply chain, the better off you will be, and you might even be able to dodge the next sort of CLOP type of attack by already being patched and updated. And nothing is more satisfying, John, than already having the patches in place when senior management is coming down to your basement bunker and asking, are we good? And you can say, yeah, we were good last week. Yeah, high fives.
For sure. Ian, that's all the time we have for questions for this session. Remember, folks, Ian follows up well, and we'll forward your questions on to him. Let's see, we're going to take a short break right now. We'll be back at the top of the hour for our second session, Modern Multi-Cloud Security Best Practices. Many, many thanks to Ian Thornton-Trump for a great session and to our sponsor, Rubrik, for making it possible.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course our sponsor, Rubrik, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I'm here to moderate the second session of our Q4 Multi-Cloud Security Check Summit, the top threats of your multi-cloud right now, called Modern Multi-Cloud Security Best Practices. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey, 22-time Microsoft MVP and technology writer. Throughout his career, Brian has written or contributed to dozens of IT books and created numerous full-length video training courses. He's also published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of these blogs can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column on redmondmag.com. Take it away, Brad.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Chris. So today we're going to be talking all about multi-cloud security best practices. And at a high level, multi-cloud security is really not all that different from conventional security, meaning that multi-cloud has a reputation for being complicated, and for good reason. As we all know, multi-cloud is complicated. There are a lot of moving parts. But really, when you stop and think about it, multi-cloud is really just kind of a scaled-up version of the things that we all did every single day before multi-cloud ever came into existence. So in my mind, one of the best things that you can do with regard to multi-cloud security is focus on the foundational type things, because if you get the basics down, then that's going to go a long, long way toward keeping your multi-cloud deployment secure. So that's kind of where I want to spend the first part of this presentation, is talking about some really basic security concepts that can be extended to your multi-cloud environment. And then once I do that, I'm going to talk about some challenges that are unique to multi-cloud environments, and then I'll go into discussing some security best practices that are specific to multi-cloud environments. So that's kind of my plan for this presentation. And I want to start off by talking about the 13 laws of cybersecurity risks. Now, there are several different sets of laws out there. There are several different versions of something called the immutable laws of cybersecurity. This is a little bit different from that. These are the laws of cybersecurity risks. And most of these came from Microsoft. They have a page with 10 laws of cybersecurity risks. And I've taken theirs and I've added 3 to it that are purely made up by myself. So with that, let's go ahead and get into it. So the first rule of cybersecurity risk is security success is running the attacker's ROI. So let me explain. Early on, when cyber attacks tended to occur, those attacks were motivated by a variety of different things. But a lot of times, those attacks were purely for notoriety. Somebody with some coding skills wanted to gain fame for themselves, so they would do an attack, or you might have somebody who was just a thrill seeker with computer skills, and so they might do an attack. A lot of times they would plant their name on an application screen so that you see that it's been hacked when the application loads, things like that. But since that time, things have changed a lot. Today, very few of the attacks that we see are motivated by things like thrill seeking or the wish for notoriety. Most of the attacks that are happening today are motivated by profit. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other types of attacks. Certainly politically motivated attacks are a thing too. But the vast majority of the attacks that I tend to see are motivated by profit. So the idea is that anytime that a group targets an organization for attack, with the goal of making a profit, there are going to be certain costs that are associated with that attack. As weird as it may sound, a lot of these cyber criminal gangs are actually run as a business. They have a staff, they have employees who get paid, and they operate as a business. So like any business, they have certain costs that they have to account for. They have to make sure their staff gets paid. They have the cost of the resources that are used in the attack. So if you really want to protect your organization, one of the best things that you can do is make it so that attacking your organization costs more than what it's worth. In other words, when a cybersecurity or a cyber criminal gang seeks to target an organization, they have a number in mind of how much money they think they're going to be able to get out of that attack. Maybe it's a ransom demand that they think that they're going to be able to get paid. And this number isn't arbitrary. This number is very often derived through research. These gangs will read business publications and find out what the organization is worth, how much damage could potentially be inflicted by a cyber attack, and they'll come up with a number from there. I've even heard stories of some of these gangs going so far as to research an organization's cyber insurance policy to find out what the payout is from that policy. So they have an absolute number in mind a lot of times before the attack ever begins. So your goal should make it so that they don't stand to make any profit. In other words, it's going to cost them more to perform the attack than for them to get, or than what they would potentially earn from a payoff. So basically run the economics of the attack. So rule number 2, not keeping up is falling behind. And there are a lot of different ways that you could interpret this rule. The way that I tend to think of this rule is that the tools that are available to attackers change over time, and they give more and more power to the attackers. So what does this mean? Well, to look at it through a modern lens, AI is the thing that everybody's talking about at the moment, and certainly there are cyber criminals that are using AI tools for malicious purposes. That kind of goes without saying. But this rule holds true at even a more fundamental level. The basic idea is that computing power and available resources increase exponentially, both for businesses and for cyber criminals. So if you really stop and think about it, at one time, the gold standard for password security was use an 8-character complex password. That was what all of the security experts recommended at that time. And the thinking behind that recommendation was that if you use 8 characters and the password is complex, then it would take so long based on the technology of the time to brute force crack the password that it becomes totally impractical to do so. But what happened? Well, computing power increased exponentially since those days. And so now an 8-character password is almost trivial. I was doing some reading this morning to find out how long it would actually take to crack an 8-character password based on today's technology. And it kind of depends on the way that the password is constructed. If the password is made up of only lowercase letters, then it can be cracked instantaneously. If it's really complex, meaning that it's made up of uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numbers, and special characters, then based on today's technology, such a password could be cracked in less than a day. So that 8-character recommendation really isn't valid anymore. Hence the point that not keeping up is falling behind. So imagine if somebody got their security training back in the early days, they learned that 8 characters is the gold standard, and they never moved forward from that. Security recommendations changed, but they didn't bother to keep up with those changing recommendations. Well, that person would be falling behind because they're not aware of things that they may be doing in their own organization that just don't cut it anymore, and they're actively jeopardizing their security. So rule number 3, productivity always wins. The basic idea behind this one really comes down to human nature. The idea is that end users really don't care about cybersecurity. There might be a few, but for the most part, users don't really care about things IT related. That's the IT department's job. The user wants to come in, do their job, get paid, and go home. They don't want to have to think about those external things like cybersecurity. So why does this matter? Well, if the user has certain things that they have to get done every day as a part of their job, that's non-negotiable. Those things have to be done. So they're going to actively look for things that are going to make it easier for them to do their job. And if cybersecurity happens to get in the way, then they're going to look for ways to circumvent that cybersecurity as a way of making their job easier. History has shown countless examples of this, oftentimes related to shadow IT. One of the best examples that I can think of, and this is a really old example, but Back when wireless networking first came out, most organizations at the time banned wireless networks because they considered them to be a security risk. And users, on the other hand, absolutely loved the wireless networks because of the freedom that they allowed them to have. So what tended to happen a lot at that time was that users would go to Best Buy or wherever, buy their own wireless access point, and plug it into the network jack in their office. And then that user had a wireless network that was completely unsanctioned by the organization. So eventually IT caught on, and they realized, hey, users are going to use wireless networks with or without us. It's better to just go ahead and give them wireless capabilities, but do it in a secure manner, as opposed to letting them bring in their own hardware and deploy it in a totally insecure manner. The point is that productivity always wins. And if security isn't seamless to the user, if it does something to make their job harder, they're going to look for ways to get around that. So rule number 4, attackers don't care. And this is kind of my personal favorite rule out of all of them on the list, simply because there's so much truth in it. With regard to cybersecurity, IT pros tend to think in terms of lists. I'm sure we've all seen articles, and I know I'm guilty of writing some of these, where whoever the author is will outline, hey, here's 10 things that you can do to secure your network, and if you do these 10 things, you're going to be so secure. We've all seen articles like that. And even if you take publications out of the picture, things like the Microsoft Best Practices Analyzer and some of the tools that are built into Microsoft 365 are basically the same way. They'll give you a list of security recommendations that you should implement in order to make your organization more secure. Now, lists like this are important. I'm not trying to downplay the importance of those things, because if there is a security recommendation that you can put in place that's going to make your organization more secure, then you should absolutely do that. That kind of goes without saying. But the important takeaway is that the attackers don't use those lists. No attacker is going to sit down with an article like, hey, here's 10 things you can do to secure your organization, and then start checking off the items on the list to see if their intended target has done those things. Instead, attackers think in terms of graphs. They're like, okay, I'm at step A, I need to get to step D. What path can I take to get there? And they will use absolutely anything at their disposal to get from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 and so on. So the idea being that you need to take a look at your organization, particularly your multi-cloud deployment, and see what weaknesses potentially exist. What resources might an attacker leverage in order to gain a foothold in your network? And then eliminate those resources or do something to lock them down. Because remember, the goal is to run the return on investment for the attacker. Make it so difficult and so expensive that an attack is not worth their while. Rule number 5, ruthless prioritization is a survival skill. The idea behind this one is that nobody has all of the resources to take care of every potential security vulnerability. It's just not going to happen. There's always going to be conditions of not enough money, not enough time, maybe not even enough skills or enough training. There's always going to be some kind of limitation that's going to prohibit an organization from addressing every single security vulnerability. And even if an organization miraculously does manage to handle every vulnerability, a new one will come up tomorrow. So there's always going to be some kind of security vulnerability. So the important thing is to prioritize those vulnerabilities. Look at what you can do that's going to have the greatest impact on your organization's overall security, and focus your efforts there first. And then once you've taken care of those high priority things, then move on to the less important things. Rule 6, cybersecurity is a team sport. This rule essentially just says that you don't have to do everything yourself. That if you can outsource some of these security-oriented tasks, then maybe that's a good idea, particularly if there's someone who can do a better job than you or can do it at a more cost-effective level than you. I kind of have mixed feelings about this rule. On the surface, it makes sense. If somebody else is out there who can do a better job of security than you can, then why not outsource to them? On the flip side, though, there are an awful lot of IT pros who have lost their jobs to security outsourcing. And there's also the matter of trust. Security is only as trustworthy as the person who implements it. So if you hand over all of your organization's security tasks to a security vendor, how do you know for sure that you can trust them or the people that work for them? So just something to think about. My recommendation would be to take a mixed approach. handle some of your security in-house, but if there are things that you find to be particularly difficult or that you're struggling with the cost of, maybe look at outsourcing those particular things. Rule 7, your network isn't as trustworthy as you think it is. The idea here is that you should really work toward a zero trust framework. In other words, just because a resource is trustworthy at the time that it comes onto your network doesn't mean it's going to remain trustworthy. You never know when that particular resource, be it a device, a user account, or whatever, you never know when that resource is going to become compromised and start working against your network and against your security initiatives. So it's important to take a zero trust approach and look for ways that you can prove the validity of that resource every time that it's used. Rule number 8, isolated networks aren't automatically secure. This one sounds a little bit weird, but it's something I've actually seen in the real world. The idea is that if you've got a workload that's so sensitive that you absolutely cannot have somebody coming into it, then you can create an air-gapped network. In other words, a network that is totally isolated, not connected to the internet, not connected to any other networks. It stands on its own. So a network like that can be very secure. I'll say that up front. But there are ways that it can become compromised. And as I mentioned, I've seen this in real life. One way is that somebody decides to patch the machines on the network. So they bring in some sort of removable media and use that to patch workloads or to introduce new software. Well, if that removable media happens to be compromised, maybe it contains a virus or something like that, well, then you've just introduced something malicious into your isolated network. Another way that I've seen isolated networks end up being compromised is because somebody does something dumb. Here's this nice, secure, isolated network, and, we momentarily need connectivity to pick your resource of choice. So somebody either knowingly or unknowingly plugs in a network router, connects it to another resource, and bam, that isolated network is no longer isolated. So just something to think about. Rule number 9, encryption alone isn't a data protection solution. Now, encryption is important, and this is actually a theme I'm going to be coming back to a few times throughout this presentation. But encryption is important, but it's not the be-all, end-all that it's sometimes made out to be, because your encryption is only as strong as your decryption key. So if you're not adequately protecting that key, then the encrypted data that's protected by that key isn't necessarily going to be protected either. And then rule number 10, technology doesn't solve people and process problems. The idea behind this is really simple. All of this best security in the world doesn't do a thing if you don't know how to use it. If you're practicing bad security habits, then the technology isn't going to save you. To put this in more practical terms, the way that I tend to think of this particular point is like a house with a really fancy alarm system, but a homeowner who just leaves the key in the lock in the front door for anybody to use. Because at that point, you've made it super easy for anybody to walk in the front door, and all the technology behind that fancy alarm system does nothing to help. So at this point, we're moving on from the Microsoft rules and getting into the 3 rules that I created. So law number 11, your data is your problem. And again, this one is kind of a recurring theme. But the idea is that the cloud providers really aren't all that interested in your data or the security of that data. The cloud provider has one job, and that's to keep their cloud infrastructure secure. So just because you're hosting a workload or data or whatever on a cloud that is known to be highly secure doesn't necessarily mean that those resources that you create on that cloud are going to be secure. It's up to you to secure those resources. And the cloud provider generally doesn't do anything to assist with that. They assume that you're going to do whatever it is that you find to be in your best interest to keep that data and those workloads secure. Law number 12, a vulnerability in one cloud can lead to a breach in another. So one of the big problems with a multi-cloud environment is that by its very nature, cloud resources are connected together. So the reason why this is sometimes problematic is because larger organizations will often distribute security duties among different teams. So imagine for a moment that you've got 2 clouds, and we won't use any names here. We'll just assume 2 generic clouds. And you've got a workload that's distributed across those 2 clouds. And you've got 2 different security teams, one with responsibility for one cloud and another with responsibility for the other cloud. And just to make things interesting, let's pretend that one of these security teams does a really, really good job. And let's assume that the other security team maybe is kind of the organization's B squad, so to speak. In other words, they don't have the skills of the first security team, or maybe they've just got kind of a lackluster attitude. At any rate, the security on one cloud is weaker than the security on the other. The implication behind this is that if there's a breach in one cloud because of that weak security, then because the application is distributed across clouds, then it may be possible for that breach to extend to the other cloud. So as I talk about this, remember rule number 5 of the 10 immutable laws of security. Rule number 5 was that weak passwords trump strong security. Now, these rules are different than the rules that I went over earlier. This is from a totally different set of rules, the 10 immutable laws of security. And here are those laws. I'm not going to go into these in depth, but I do want to briefly present them because I think there's value in them. And the source where these came from is printed down at the bottom of the slide. For all of the remaining slides, anytime that I took something from another website, I've provided the source just so that you can dig into it a little bit deeper if you want to. So law number 1, if a bad guy can persuade you to run his program on your computer, it's not solely your computer. Law 2, if a bad guy can alter the operating system on your computer, it's not your computer anymore. Law 3, if a bad guy has unrestricted physical access to your computer, it's not your computer anymore. Law 4, if you allow a bad guy to run active content on your website, it's not your website anymore. Law 5, weak passwords trump strong security. This goes back to the immutable law that I was talking about just a second ago, that a vulnerability in one cloud can lead to a breach in another. So in other words, if you have really weak passwords or a weak security mechanism in one cloud, then that can bleed over to another. Law 6, a computer is only as secure as the administrator is trustworthy. I talked about that one a little bit from the perspective of security outsourcing. Law 7, encrypted data is only as secure as its decryption key. That's another one that we talked about a little bit. Law 8, an out-of-date anti-malware scanner is only marginally better than no scanner at all. Law 9, absolute anonymity isn't practically achievable online or offline. And law number 10, technology is not a panacea. So let's move on to the last law that I want to talk about, and that is monitoring is everything. And the reason why I say this is because you can't secure what you can't see. So if you think about it, a multi-cloud environment is really just a widely distributed network. Yes, there are separate physical networks, but when you run an application in a multi-cloud environment, you've essentially created a distributed network because you've connected the clouds together. And so you need to be able to monitor all of the resources across those clouds in a very consistent way. So now that I've talked about all of these different security rules, let's move on and talk about some of the more pressing security challenges to consider with regard to a multi-cloud environment. So challenge number 1, lack of unified management and governance. And the basic idea behind this one is that when you've got a multi-cloud environment, it can be really challenging to manage those clouds in a consistent manner because every cloud provider has their own way of doing things. And so it can be tough to implement consistent policies across clouds because the mechanisms for putting those policies into place might be a little bit different from one cloud to the next. So the way that you would get around those challenges is to have a unified governance plan in place so that things are always done in a consistent manner across all of the clouds that you use. Challenge number 2, and this one actually kind of breaks down into a few different challenges, but silos, staffing constraints, and training gaps. The way that I like to think about this particular challenge is that when you start using multi-cloud environments, you're going to have differing resources from one cloud to the next. There may be silos. I mentioned a moment ago that you can't secure what you can't monitor. And when you have a multi-cloud environment, it's really easy to accidentally create silos that fall outside of your monitoring scope, thereby giving you security blind spots. But with regard to staffing constraints and training gaps, the idea there is that it's impossible for an IT pro to be an expert in absolutely everything. Let's suppose for a moment that you've got an IT staff who are really, really awesome with regard to operating in Microsoft Azure. And then all of a sudden there comes about a need to run a particular workload on AWS. Well, even though there are a lot of similarities between AWS and Azure, somebody who is an Azure expert isn't necessarily going to immediately be an AWS expert. It's going to take them a while to find their way around the AWS cloud because Amazon has different names for certain things than Microsoft does. The interface is laid out differently. There are just subtle nuances that don't translate between the two clouds. So you're going to have a skills gap there, at least until those people come up to speed and gain that expertise in the Amazon cloud. And the problem with that is that those inconsistencies and those training gaps can make it difficult to adequately secure resources in that cloud that you've newly brought online. And then that can lead to security incidents. So it's really important to identify where those training gaps are and where those skills gaps are so that you can address those early on and make sure that as you deploy workloads in new clouds, that you're doing that in a secure manner. Okay, the next one, protecting workloads regardless of where they're housed. And really this particular challenge comes down to the concept of consistency. Because when you operate a multi-cloud environment, you can have workloads and or data scattered just about anywhere. You may have some workloads running on premises. You might have workloads running in Cloud A or Cloud B, or who knows where they're going to be. And you don't want your security to vary just because of where a workload happens to be running at a given moment. You really want to make sure that everything is secured in a very consistent manner. Because not only does that help to ensure that those resources, those workloads, the data, that they remain secure, but it also helps with management. Because can you imagine working in an environment where security differed radically depending on which cloud you were working in, and then trying to manage those resources and trying to keep track of, okay, it's secured one way here, but a different way here, and it would be a logistical nightmare. So the more that you can do to keep things consistent, the easier it's going to be to secure various resources and to manage those resources in an effective way. So another challenge is not considering workload mobility. And what I'm really getting at here is that just because a workload is running in a particular location today doesn't necessarily mean that that workload is going to be running in the same place tomorrow or next month or next year or what have you. So in a cloud environment, or particularly a multi-cloud environment, there's a really good chance that workloads are going to move around. It might become more cost-effective to run a workload in a given cloud, or a particular cloud provider may end up retiring a particular API that you're using for that workload, so you need to move the workload somewhere else. There's a million different reasons why you may end up moving a workload from one cloud to another. You could even end up repatriating certain workloads. In other words, moving those workloads from the cloud back into your own data center. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is because you have to do your security planning with data mobility and workload mobility in mind. So you don't want to have to sacrifice security just because you're moving a workload. You want to design your multi-cloud security architecture in a way that allows you to maintain the same level of security regardless of where a workload is running and where that workload is getting moved to. You especially don't want to end up in a situation in which you move a workload and then that workload is suddenly unprotected until you can put security back into place in the new location. You want to make sure that the security follows the workload no matter where it goes. So what are some more challenges? Well, the next one on the list is lack of interoperability. And this kind of goes back to something that I've mentioned a few times throughout this presentation, and that's the idea that each cloud provider has their own way of doing things. Yes, the major cloud provider, I'm talking about the hyperscalers, tend to offer a very consistent set of services. Microsoft, Azure, IBM, Google, and some of the others, they tend to offer a lot of the same capabilities in their cloud. Yes, each one of these providers offers certain services that are unique to them, but their core competencies tend to be more or less the same from one cloud provider to the other. But even so, there are differences within those core competencies. You may have a cloud provider that offers a certain API, whereas the API provided by a different provider is completely different. meaning that the way that you interact with that application is also different. Maybe there are different protocols used for a particular service in one cloud versus in another cloud. And those differences can lead to big problems with regard to application migration. An application may have to be completely refactored in order to go from one cloud to another whenever mobility ends up being needed. But when we look at these differences from a security standpoint, what it really boils down to is that without proper integration, security policies might not be enforced consistently across all cloud environments. So in other words, those differences in APIs and things like that can cause your security policies to be enforced one way in one cloud and a different way in a different cloud. Now, sometimes those differences are really subtle, but what I've seen at least once or twice in real-world environments is a situation in which an organization had a single pane of glass interface to manage resources across multiple clouds, but there were certain features that maybe one cloud provider supported and another didn't. So if you enable that particular feature, it works great until you move the application to a different cloud, and then that feature is not supported. Most of the security policies are still supported, but that one little thing isn't. It's important to be aware of those differences and the impact that they can have on your security. And sometimes that's a tall order, but it's important to know that those types of differences can exist and to realize what impact they could potentially have on you. So the next thing, misconfiguration or configuration drift. Basically what this one is getting at is that misconfigurations or configuration drift can occur when changes are made in one cloud environment but not replicated across another cloud environment. And really this one comes down to consistency again. So imagine that you have resources in a couple of different clouds and you're trying to maintain a consistent security policy, and you apply changes to that policy in one cloud but you forget to do it in another cloud. Well, at that point your security is going to be completely inconsistent because you've made some changes in one location but not made those changes in another location, thereby leaving the unchanged location more vulnerable. So it's really important to have a system in place to make sure that you're consistent with your security, regardless of where a workload may be running at. Yet another security challenge, and this is one of the big ones, is lack of visibility across environments. Now, I've talked a lot about the importance of having a single pane of glass interface so that you can see all of the resources across your clouds that you're using. Because, as I said, you can't secure what you can't see. So it's super important to have that visibility and to have that single pane of glass management experience. That's critical. But you have to take things just a step further than that. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it's great to be able to see into your clouds, to be able to manage things through a single pane of glass, but you can't stop there. You also need to have that consistent interface for detecting and responding to security incidents. So imagine for a moment that somebody decides to do an attack on one of your workloads, and that workload just happens to span multiple clouds. Well, if you're performing separate security monitoring for each cloud, then both of those monitoring tools are going to provide you with signals indicating that some kind of attack is underway. But because you're using two separate tools that aren't connected to each other, they're not going to exchange data. They're not going to give you the big picture view of what's actually going on. Whoever happens to be monitoring those tools is going to say, hey, there are some abnormalities in Cloud A, and there are some abnormalities in Cloud B, but it's going to be up to them to connect the dots and figure out what's really going on. The tool isn't going to be able to assemble the entire attack signature simply because it's only monitoring one subset of the entire infrastructure as opposed to looking across cloud. The next one, an assumption that attacks will be cloud-specific. And this is another one of those traps that I see IT pros falling into on a pretty regular basis. A lot of times, the various publications out there that talk about attacks in the cloud world, we'll talk about things like an attack against the Microsoft cloud or attacks against an Amazon cloud. And what I'm really talking about there is attacks against a specific tenant, not against the cloud itself. But in reality, attacks can span clouds. Because remember, when I talked about the security rules, one of those rules was that attackers don't care. They're going to use whatever resources are available to them. Now, For legitimate businesses, very often we operate in a multi-cloud environment and do that for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's because of cost, maybe it's a way of cobbling together a collection of best-of-breed services. Whatever the reason, multi-cloud is a thing, and businesses use multi-cloud. So it really shouldn't be unthinkable that criminals also use multi-cloud environments and have plans in place and techniques in place for staging multi-cloud attacks. So you can't fall into the mindset of thinking, oh, okay, an attack is going to be directed specifically at the Microsoft cloud or specifically at the AWS cloud. An attack might start there, but there's absolutely no reason in the world why that attack is going to be isolated to that particular cloud. If you're running workloads in a multi-cloud configuration, then there's a really, really good chance that an attack that starts in one cloud is also going to end up spanning to other clouds. Okay, and the next challenge on the list is maintaining consistent access controls. And what this really boils down to is just making sure that you're doing things consistently across your clouds with regard to authorization and access control. So really what this means is that there's a strong need for revisiting your authorization policies and your access permissions on a regular basis, just to make sure that they are in line with one another across cloud environments. Then we move on to shadow IT. And shadow IT is one of those things that I talked about earlier. I talked about the example with the Wi-Fi routers, but that's certainly not the only form of shadow IT. Shadow IT has been around probably for as long as IT itself, and it continues to be an issue even in a cloud-first world. Now, for anybody out there who might not be familiar with the term shadow IT, even though I've used it several times throughout the presentation already, the basic idea behind shadow IT is a user who takes it upon themselves to acquire IT resources and do things on their own outside of the control of the IT department and without their knowledge. So that's what shadow IT is. And in some ways, the cloud has actually made shadow IT worse, because at one time, shadow IT was somewhat cost prohibitive. If a user wanted to engage in shadow IT practices, there was a real financial commitment. They had to purchase software, they had to purchase hardware to run it on. That could be really pricey, and that would probably end up being noticed in somebody's budget. On the other hand, having access to cloud resources makes it a little bit more convenient to engage in shadow IT. So in other words, a user no longer has to go out and provision or acquire server hardware and purchase software and go through this great big setup and attract a lot of attention. Instead, they can just break out the corporate credit card, set up an AWS account or a Microsoft Azure account or what have you, and then begin using cloud services to their heart's content. And as long as they keep it cheap, probably nobody's going to be any the wiser. And that can be a very real risk to your security, because if a user is engaging in shadow IT practices, they're doing it to intentionally circumvent limits that the IT department has put into place. And that can end up making the data that's contained within that environment vulnerable to compliance problems, but also vulnerable to leakage and other security threats. So now that I've talked about some of the challenges that exist in multi-cloud environments, I want to get into a discussion of several best practices. So best practice number one, and this ties back to something I've already mentioned a couple of times, but that's understand how shared models work. The basic idea behind this is simple. Every cloud provider out there that I know of has a shared responsibility model, meaning that when somebody subscribes to that cloud, there are certain things that the cloud provider is responsible for, but there are also certain things that the subscriber is responsible for. Generally speaking, the cloud provider is going to be responsible for maintaining the integrity of the underlying infrastructure. So they keep up the servers that make up the cloud. They do all of the hardware maintenance. They apply security patches. They do whatever it takes to keep the cloud itself running. But the subscriber creates resources on top of the cloud. They create data within the cloud. And it's generally their responsibility to take measures to secure those workloads, to keep their data secure, to back up that data. So a simple way of saying it is that the cloud provider is responsible for the cloud, and the subscriber is responsible for anything that exists within the tenant that they create on that cloud. So even though that's a pretty accurate generalization, it's a good idea to just review the shared responsibility models for each cloud that you use just to see what it truly is that you're responsible for. So the next best practice is choose the right cloud vendor. This one sounds really weird, but there is a method to the madness. As I mentioned earlier, all of the major hyperscaler vendors offer a core set of services that are basically the same as one another. If one vendor comes out with a particular innovation, you can bet it's only going to be a matter of time before the other vendors come out with something similar, assuming that it's based on one of the core services. So there is a lot of consistency from one vendor to the next to the next. Now, having said that, there are differences. One provider might have a better solution for a particular service than the other providers do, or it might be a little bit cheaper to run a workload on one cloud than another. So there are any number of reasons why an organization might choose one cloud over another when it comes to running a particular workload. But historically, those types of decisions have come down to one of a few things. Either A, a provider offers a best-of-breed solution, so they can do a better job of running this particular workload than their competitors can. Or B, it's going to be more cost-effective. Or C, there's just more of a familiarity with one cloud than another. The IT department does a lot of work in Azure, but they're not all that familiar with AWS, so they naturally gravitate towards Azure because it's easier for them to operate the workload in that environment because they're already familiar with it. Those are the types of reasons that have traditionally been used for choosing one cloud vendor over another. But when we're talking about multi-cloud security, it's really important to adopt a security approach, a security-first approach to cloud workloads. So rather than just looking at cost or who has the best breed solution, it's also important to look at who has the best security, who can do the best job of helping me to protect those workloads. Now, again, the cloud provider themselves aren't necessarily in the business of protecting the things that you run on that cloud, but every cloud provider out there, at least the big ones, does provide tools that you can use to secure your stuff for yourself. So you've got to look at what those tools are that they offer you, and then choose a location for running a workload based on the security tools that are available and your ability to use those tools to protect the workload. Another best practice is use different security policies for different services. Now, this one really sounds like kind of a no-brainer, but it's important nonetheless, so I wanted to go ahead and mention it. The idea is this. One of the topics that I've stressed over and over throughout this presentation is the need for consistency when running workloads in the cloud. The more you can be consistent, the easier time you're going to have securing and monitoring your workloads. But having said that, there is such a thing as too much consistency. The idea behind this slide, is that it's a really bad idea to create one security policy and apply that security policy to absolutely everything, especially when you're talking about different services. Because if you're running different types of services, then if you try to secure all of those services with one security policy, that one security policy is going to have to be really general. And so it's not going to be a very good fit for any one of the services that you're trying to protect with that policy. So it's better to have a few different types of security policies that are closely aligned with the services that you're running, as opposed to just trying to overly generalize your security policies. So there's a bit of a balance that has to be maintained. Consistency is super important, but at the same time, you can't be overly general in the name of consistency. Another best practice is always encrypt data. Now, when I was talking about those checklist items that IT pros so often read, encryption will show up on almost any one of those checklists. Especially when you're operating in the cloud, you should always encrypt your data. Now, is encryption the best possible security and all you need to do? No, absolutely not. But the way that I think of encryption is that it plays a valuable role in a larger defense in depth strategy. So in other words, defense in depth is all about using multiple security mechanisms to collectively provide good security so that way, if an attacker manages to beat one of those defenses, you still have other defenses that are continuing to secure those resources. So encryption provides invaluable protection because if your data is encrypted, then a hacker is not going to be able to do very much with that data. And if the data is leaked, then it's not going to be any use to them unless they also happen to have the decryption keys. but you can't depend on encryption as your sole means of protecting your data. You need to be doing other things as well. Real-time monitoring. This is another important thing to do in a cloud environment, because when you monitor your resources in real time, that allows you to do attack detection in real time so that you know when an incident occurs rather than finding out about it later. But again, when it comes to security monitoring, it's really important to use a tool that will give you a cross-cloud view. So you should be able to monitor all of your clouds in real time through a single pane of glass. And the nice thing about that is that will allow you to trace an attack from its point of origin across clouds and see exactly what the attacker is trying to do. Another best practice, and this is another one of those that sounds kind of weird, but it's something that's really important, is to be relentless but consistent with regard to tagging. Now, for anybody who might not be familiar with tagging, a tag is essentially just a text-based key-value pair that can be applied to a resource. So clouds like Azure and AWS will allow you to apply tags to almost any resource that you create in the cloud, whether that resource is a virtual machine, a database, a file system, what have you. You can apply a tag to it. And different organizations use different strategies for tagging. Some will do departmental tagging so that they can apply a tag as a way of conveying who owns that particular resource. I've also seen tagging used as a way of identifying workloads. So this resource belongs to this workload, that resource belongs to that workload, that sort of thing. There are a million different strategies for tagging. But the reason why I wanted to mention tagging is because when done effectively, and effectively is the key word here, when done effectively, tagging can go a long way toward helping you to better manage all of the resources that you're trying to secure. So the key to effective tagging is to develop a really rigid tagging taxonomy that encompasses everything that you're trying to achieve, but that leaves no room for ambiguity. And then follow that taxonomy religiously. So don't get in the habit of being lazy and failing to tag resources, because that undermines your entire tagging strategy. But also don't make up new tags on the fly. Be extremely consistent with regard to the tags that you use. And if you follow those principles, that's going to make it so much easier to manage your resources regardless of which cloud they happen to be in. The next best practice is use a unified management and governance platform. That's something that we've already talked about a lot, using a single pane of glass interface to manage and monitor your resources regardless of which cloud that they reside in. Implement a comprehensive identity and access management strategy. In other words, take advantage of things like role-based access control and multi-factor authentication and centralized management of user accounts. But be extremely consistent about the way that you do that, particularly with regard to role-based access control, because it's easy to fall into the trap of creating specific roles using role-based access control, but having those roles vary slightly from one cloud to the next. And what that means is that if a particular user or a resource gets moved from one cloud to another and you apply the same RBAC to that resource, then the permissions that exist for that resource are going to vary depending on the resources that, depending on the permissions that have been assigned via RBAC. So be extremely consistent with regard to your use of role-based access control. And the reason why you would want to do that too is that using role-based access control is part of a least privilege access strategy, because the only thing worse than an unintended accumulation of privileges is an unattended accumulation of privileges that happens across clouds. Another best practice is to regularly conduct vulnerability assessments and automated penetration testing. And I'm going to go ahead and move on towards the end because there's one final point that I want to make, and I'm rapidly running out of time. But I would highly recommend going back and checking out the remaining slides because there's a lot of good stuff there. So the last point that I want to make, and a lot of you can probably guess what this is going to be, is that the single most important thing that you can possibly do to secure your multi-cloud environment is to be extremely consistent with regard to the controls that you put in place. If you use a security strategy in one cloud, make sure you're using it in the other. If you set permissions one way in one cloud, make sure that you set those permissions the same way in other clouds that you use. And not only will this make management easier, but it's also going to make it a lot easier to detect attacks that happen in your environment. Because this is the same strategy that's put into place by Las Vegas casinos. If you've ever visited a casino in Vegas, and I'm not a gambler by any stretch of the imagination, but if you've ever visited a casino and played any of the table games, you've probably noticed that the dealers deal those games in an extremely consistent manner. It doesn't matter which table you sit down at, the dealers are going to deal the games in exactly the same way. You've probably seen in movies, or maybe even in real life, who knows, where somebody moves their thumb the wrong way in a poker game and all of a sudden security's on them. Well, the reason why that's possible is because of the uniformity of the way that security is applied. If security is exercised in an extremely consistent way, then any abnormalities stand out big time. That's why the Vegas casinos use that particular method for their table games. And I think that the same method works extremely well when it comes to IT security, because if you're super consistent with the way that you do things, then any abnormalities are going to stand out, and that will allow you to more easily spot an attack in progress. So with that said, I am about out of time, but I want to go ahead and leave a second for questions and answers.
Yeah, sure. We have time for just a couple of questions here. Let's jump in with this one. Are there any shortcuts to implementing tagging if we already have a lot of cloud objects in place, but have never used tags in the past?
Oh, well, what I would recommend doing in a situation like that is using scripting. It's really going to depend on what types of objects you've got in place and what your capabilities are, but you may very well be able to use a CLI environment or perhaps even a PowerShell script to go out and identify specific resources and automatically apply tags to that. All of the major cloud providers do offer command line interfaces and scripting capabilities. So assuming that you can come up with a way of automating, a way of figuring out which resources are which, there are automated ways of applying tags through scripting.
Great. Here's a great question. You mentioned shadow IT as a risk. Is shadow IT still relevant in a cloud-first world?
I would say absolutely. Shadow IT has always been a problem, and I think it always will be. It's not that the risk of shadow IT or the threat of shadow IT has gone away because of the cloud, but rather that the nature of it has changed. In the past, shadow IT was all about installing something you're not supposed to on your PC or going out and acquiring some piece of hardware to run software that the IT doesn't know about. In a cloud-first world, shadow IT is more about subscribing to a software as a service cloud and running something there and having data that IT knows nothing about, or going out to AWS or the Google Cloud or whatever and setting up a subscription and running resources there. So shadow IT absolutely still goes on. It just takes a different form than what it used to.
Okay, let's end it on this question. What are some things that I should look out for when shopping for a multi-cloud management tool?
When it comes to shopping for a multi-cloud management tool, the biggest thing is you want to make sure that it has support for all of the clouds that you're using. It's also important to make sure that the vendor that creates that software is regularly updating it, because the cloud providers are constantly introducing new features, new capabilities, and retiring old ones. So you want to make sure that whatever product it is that you choose is able to keep up with the changes that the cloud providers are making. That if you do that, that's going to go a long way toward making sure that that tool is going to be able to do a good job for you.
Okay, with that, let's call it a session. Thanks for the great talk, Brian.
Thanks for having me.